What if the biggest battle you'll ever face is invisible? And what if most people are completely unprepared for it without even realizing it? Because according to Father Dan Reehil, the real danger doesn't begin with chaos you can see, but with subtle openings in the mind, in habits, and in the way people slowly drift away from spiritual protection without noticing the cost. And that's where this story begins. Not with fear for fear's sake, but with a warning that sounds almost too extreme until you realize how carefully it is explained. He starts by making something very clear, something that already shifts the way you think about all of this. If someone is truly living in alignment with the gospel, he says there is no reason to live in constant fear of demonic activity. And yet, almost immediately after that reassurance, he opens a door most people don't expect. Because while ordinary life has its struggles, there are accounts documented through centuries of saints and exorcists where the spiritual pressure becomes something far more intense than everyday temptation. And that's where things begin to escalate in a way that forces you to question how much of reality is actually unseen. But instead of presenting it like a horror story, he reframes it. These extreme cases, he says, are not random punishments, and they are not signs that evil has power on its own. They only happen in very specific spiritual conditions, usually tied to what he describes as radical holiness on one end or radical spiritual vulnerability on the other. And that tension between those two extremes is where the rest of this entire explanation unfolds, because both lead to very different kinds of encounters with the unseen world. On one end, he points to figures like Padre Pio, John Vianney, and Teresa of Avila, individuals whose spiritual lives were so intense that their experiences included physical manifestations of spiritual attack. And this is where the story becomes unsettling, not because of the details alone, but because of the reaction they had to it. According to these accounts, these saints did not respond with panic or fear, but with something that completely reframes what suffering means in a spiritual context. And that raises a question most people never think to ask. What kind of faith makes suffering feel almost irrelevant? But before that question can settle, he immediately pulls the perspective back. Because this is not, he insists, the normal experience of the average believer. In fact, he repeats it in different ways, almost like he is trying to make sure the listener doesn't misunderstand the direction of the message. Most people, he explains, do not need to worry about dramatic supernatural encounters. The more common reality is far more subtle and far more dangerous, precisely because it is ignored. And then he begins to shift the focus away from dramatic stories and towards something structured, something almost clinical in how it is described. He outlines different forms of spiritual disturbance, but not in a way that feels sensational. Instead, it is presented like stages of breakdown in spiritual protection, each one escalating in intensity if ignored. And the first of these is described as something tied to environments, not individuals. He refers to it as infestation, where a place itself seems affected. Strange sounds, sudden drops in temperature, unexplained smells, disturbances that feel consistent rather than random. And what makes this part unsettling is not just the description, but the implication behind it. Because it suggests that spaces can carry spiritual weight and that human beings are not always aware of what they are stepping into when they enter certain environments. And just as that idea begins to settle, he immediately explains that there are established responses within the church meant to address exactly these situations, as if to remind the listener that nothing here is uncontrolled or chaotic. But the escalation doesn't stop there. He moves next into what he describes as oppression, and this is where the focus shifts from places to people. Unlike external disturbances, this stage involves direct physical or psychological pressure on individuals. He references cases where people experience unexplained physical marks or ongoing disturbances that cannot be easily explained through natural causes. And while he presents these accounts as rare, he emphasizes that they are significant precisely because they point to a deeper principle, that human beings are not only physical, but also spiritual targets under certain conditions. And just as the mind starts to try to categorize these ideas, he introduces the next level, obsession, but he doesn't define it in a casual way. Instead, he describes it as an intrusive mental experience that overwhelms a person's thoughts, often in ways that feel repetitive, disturbing, or impossible to control. The key detail he emphasizes is not just the content of the thoughts, but the feeling of inability to stop them. And that detail becomes important later because it separates ordinary psychological struggle from something he frames as spiritually influenced pressure. And then, without softening the transition, he moves into the most extreme category he mentions, possession. But even here, he challenges the common assumptions people might already have. Because according to his explanation, possession does not erase the soul, nor does it remove free will entirely. Instead, it is described as a condition where control is intermittent, where influence comes and goes, but never fully overrides the core identity of the person. And that distinction is crucial because it reframes everything people think they know about spiritual warfare into something far more controlled and far less absolute than popular culture suggests. But just when it feels like the explanation is becoming too structured, too distant from real life, he brings it back to motivation. Why would any of this be allowed at all? Why would a system exist where such experiences are even possible? And here is where the narrative shifts again, because the answer is not framed in terms of fear, but in terms of consequence and freedom. He explains that in many documented cases, individuals experiencing these severe forms of spiritual distress were already deeply involved in practices he describes as spiritually dangerous. Not as isolated mistakes, but as repeated engagement with things like occult practices or intentional rejection of spiritual alignment. And this is where the warning becomes more direct, because he suggests that what people interpret as harmless curiosity or exploration can slowly lead to deeper forms of spiritual exposure without them realizing the transition is happening. But then he adds something that complicates everything he just said, because even in those situations, he insists that the purpose is not destruction, but correction. The suffering, as he describes it, often becomes the catalyst for return, for reconnection, for a complete reorientation of life. And this is where the tone shifts from warning to something closer to paradox, because what initially sounds like punishment is reframed as a pathway back to something greater. And yet, just as that idea begins to form a sense of resolution, he introduces something that completely reframes the stakes again. Because according to him, the most dangerous part is not extreme cases of spiritual disturbance. It is the slow erosion of awareness that allows people to drift without noticing they are drifting at all. He points out that many of the most common lies people believe are not dramatic or obviously false. Instead, they sound reasonable. The idea that identity is tied only to achievement, the idea that happiness depends entirely on external conditions, the idea that personal struggle can be solved purely through worldly means without spiritual grounding. And he presents these not as isolated thoughts, but as patterns that gradually weaken a person's sense of spiritual clarity over time. And this is where everything begins to tighten, because he suggests that these small distortions are often more effective than any dramatic spiritual event. Not because they are louder, but because they are quieter. And that quietness, he implies, is what makes them so effective. But then the focus shifts again, because now he begins outlining what he calls the first line of defense. And everything that has been said so far starts converging toward this point, as if the entire explanation was building toward a single structure of protection. And that structure is not described as complicated, but it is described as foundational. He begins with the sacraments, and immediately the tone changes from explanation to emphasis, because he describes them not as symbolic rituals, but as active spiritual protection. And he explains that their effectiveness is not dependent on emotional intensity, but on structure, consistency, and participation. And this is where he begins outlining what he calls the basic requirements of living within that system, though he does so in a way that still feels like part of a larger unfolding story rather than a checklist. But just as he begins to explain how this system functions as protection, he introduces a detail that shifts everything again. Because while participation provides structure, he insists that awareness alone is not enough. There must also be something deeper, something internal, something that cannot be reduced to external actions. And that is where he pauses the progression entirely, as if preparing to reveal something that changes the entire foundation of what has been discussed so far. Because the next question is no longer about what protects someone. It becomes about what happens when that protection is ignored without even realizing it. And what he says next begins to pull the entire conversation into a direction that feels far more personal than anything before it. And that question doesn't stay abstract for long, because he immediately pulls it down into something concrete, something the listener cannot ignore without also examining their own life. Because if protection is real, then the first thing that matters is whether a person is actually living inside it or only assuming they are. And that assumption, he suggests, is where most people quietly become vulnerable without ever realizing the shift has happened. So he begins to explain what he calls the first line of defense. And instead of starting with fear or complexity, he starts with something surprisingly simple, almost foundational in a way that feels easy to underestimate at first. Because according to him, the strongest protection is not dramatic spiritual experiences, but participation in what he describes as the life of the church in a consistent, living way. And that is where everything begins to tighten again. Because now the focus is not on extraordinary cases, but on ordinary habits that determine whether someone is spiritually anchored or slowly drifting. And he makes a distinction that changes the tone of everything that came before it. Because he says the sacraments are not symbolic gestures or emotional rituals, but actual points of encounter with divine grace, operating with a stability that does not depend on personal mood or subjective feeling. And that idea alone shifts the entire conversation, because it means protection is not random and it is not reserved for a few extraordinary people, but structured into something accessible, something consistent, something designed to hold a person steady even when everything else feels unstable. But instead of leaving it at that, he immediately pushes deeper, because structure alone is not enough if it is not actually practiced. And that is where he begins to outline what he calls the basic obligations of living within that spiritual framework. Not as a burden, but as a minimal alignment with a system that is already in place. And the way he describes it makes it sound less like rule following and more like staying inside a current that is already flowing in a direction meant to carry a person forward. Yet even as he explains this, he doesn't let the listener settle into comfort, because he shifts the focus towards something that most people underestimate entirely, and that is consistency. Not intensity, not occasional moments of spirituality, but consistency over time. And that is where he begins to emphasize practices like regular participation in Mass, confession, and Eucharistic life, not as isolated acts, but as ongoing points of connection that maintain alignment. And then the tone tightens again, because he introduces something that most people don't associate with spiritual danger at all. He explains that even what many would consider small lapses can have deeper consequences if they become habitual. And he does not present this as condemnation, but as awareness. Because the danger, he says, is not usually in dramatic rebellion, but in gradual disengagement that feels harmless while it is happening. And that is where confession enters the conversation in a way that completely shifts the focus again. Because he does not describe it as a formality, but as a moment of clarity. And the way he explains it makes it feel less like a ritual and more like a return to truth. Because in his framing, confession is not about performance or emotional storytelling, but about precision, about honesty, about naming what is real without dilution or avoidance. And this is where he begins to slow down the narrative and focus on something very specific, almost instructional in tone, but still embedded within the larger story he is building. because he describes how people often unintentionally weaken the meaning of confession by turning it into explanation instead of admission. And that subtle shift, he says, changes everything about its effectiveness. He emphasizes that clarity matters, that naming actions directly matters, that avoiding vague language matters, because when everything becomes softened, the encounter loses its grounding in truth. And without that grounding, the purpose becomes diluted, not because forgiveness is withheld, but because the person themselves is not fully engaging with what is being brought forward. And just when it feels like the explanation could settle into a technical teaching moment, he shifts again, because now he begins to talk about something deeper than structure. He begins talking about identity. And suddenly confession is no longer just about actions, but about truth-telling in the presence of something greater than oneself. And that leads him into a completely different layer of the discussion, because he starts to explain that the most dangerous spiritual vulnerability is not external influence, but internal distortion. The kind that convinces a person they are defined by their worst moments, or trapped by their past, or separated beyond repair from grace. And he frames this not as theory, but as one of the most common spiritual deceptions he encounters. But then he introduces a correction that shifts everything again. Because according to him, forgiveness is not dependent on feeling ready for it. It is not emotional resolution. It is a decision of will, an act that precedes emotional healing rather than follows it. And that distinction becomes crucial because it removes forgiveness from the realm of emotional negotiation and places it into the realm of choice. And that is where the teaching begins to intensify again, because he ties it directly to something central in Christian prayer, something most people repeat without fully realizing the weight of it. And he references the idea embedded in the Our Father, where forgiveness is not optional language, but part of the structure of how one approaches God. And suddenly the stakes feel higher, not because of threat, but because of alignment. Because he suggests that holding on to unforgiveness is not just an emotional burden, but a self-imposed barrier to receiving what one asks for. And that idea is not presented as metaphor, but as spiritual logic within the framework he is describing. And it forces a confrontation that feels unavoidable once it is stated clearly. But then, instead of leaving it there, he softens the emotional intensity by shifting into mercy. And this is where the narrative changes tone entirely again, because he begins describing mercy not as limited or conditional, but as overwhelming in scale. He uses imagery that reduces human failure to something small in comparison, something that cannot compete with the magnitude of divine forgiveness when it is truly understood. And then he brings in a story, and the tone immediately changes from explanation to lived reality, because now everything becomes anchored in historical consequence rather than abstract principle. He introduces the story of Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, and the weight of that name alone changes the atmosphere of the entire message. Because now the discussion is no longer theoretical, but grounded in one of the darkest human histories imaginable. And yet, instead of ending in darkness, the story moves towards something unexpected, because within that environment of extreme moral collapse, there are moments of spiritual interruption. A priest encouraging prayer even for those responsible for atrocities. A decision to maintain spiritual focus even inside a system of brutality. And those details begin to shift the direction of the story away from despair and towards something that feels almost impossible within that context. And then comes the turning point, because he describes how, even within that world, the possibility of confession still existed. And not as a symbolic idea, but as an actual event in which a man responsible for immense suffering is given the opportunity to speak, to confess, to confront his life and truth. And that moment reframes everything that came before it, because it suggests that no situation is beyond the reach of that framework he has been describing. But he doesn't stop there, because he adds something even more unexpected. He describes the atmosphere of that final moment not as chaos or resistance, but as peace. And that detail becomes the pivot point of the entire story, because it contradicts every expectation the listener might have about what that kind of moment should look like. And just when the listener begins to process that contradiction, he expands it further by describing mercy as something larger than human scale, something that absorbs even the most extreme cases into a system that does not operate on human proportionality. And that idea begins to echo back through everything he has said so far, reshaping the earlier warnings, the earlier structures, the earlier definitions. Because now the sacraments are no longer just protection, and confession is no longer just correction, and forgiveness is no longer just moral instruction. They are all part of a single system that exists not to control fear, but to restore alignment regardless of how far someone has drifted. And yet, even as that realization begins to form, he introduces one final tension that pulls everything forward again. Because if mercy is always available and protection is always accessible, then the only remaining question is not whether it exists, but whether people actually use it consistently, or only reach for it when everything else has already collapsed. And that question doesn't get answered immediately, because instead he leaves it hanging in the air, as if the real weight of the message is not in the explanation itself, but in what the listener decides to do with it after hearing it. And that is where this part ends, not with resolution, but with a quieter, more uncomfortable realization that the system he is describing is already present, and the only variable left is participation. And what he says next begins to point toward what happens when that participation becomes the difference between being anchored or being exposed to what comes when that anchor is gone entirely. Because once that question is left hanging in the air, it doesn't just disappear. It starts following the rest of the message everywhere it goes. If participation is what keeps a person anchored, then what actually happens when that participation becomes inconsistent, mechanical, or slowly replaced by distraction without the person even noticing the shift? And this is where the explanation changes again, because now it is no longer about dramatic extremes or rare cases. It becomes about drift, the kind of drift that doesn't announce itself, the kind that feels normal while it is happening. And according to him, that is where most spiritual vulnerability actually begins, not in rebellion, but in forgetting. So he brings the focus back to something he already mentioned earlier, but now it carries a different weight. The sacraments are not just structure, and they are not just obligations. He reframes them as living points of contact, almost like constant recalibration points that keep a person aligned with something greater than their immediate emotional state. And the danger, he suggests, is not that people reject them outright, but that they slowly reduce them into habits without awareness. And that is where he tightens the message again, because he begins to explain that anything repeated without intention eventually loses its interior force. Not because the system stops working, but because the person stops receiving it fully. And that distinction becomes critical, because it shifts responsibility back onto awareness rather than assumption. But then he moves further, because structure alone is not the full picture. He begins to talk about something deeper, something he describes as relationship. And the moment he introduces that word, the tone softens but also intensifies, because now the conversation is no longer about actions but about presence. He explains that the sacraments, as powerful as they are not meant to function in isolation from a lived relationship with Christ. And that idea changes everything that came before it, because it means protection is not just about participation, but about connection. A connection that is active, ongoing, and personal enough that it reshapes how a person moves through everyday life. And this is where the explanation becomes almost conversational in tone, as if he is no longer addressing a system, but addressing the listener directly. Because he begins to describe what it looks like when that relationship is actually alive. Not as an abstract idea, but as a practical shift in perception. The way a person enters a room, the way they respond to pressure, the way fear loses its control over decision-making without needing to be consciously fought every time. And then he introduces something simple but powerful in context, the idea of prayer as conversation rather than obligation. And he doesn't present it as complexity, he presents it as availability. a constant openness that changes how isolated a person feels in moments of difficulty. And that shift, he suggests, is part of what strengthens resilience long before any crisis ever appears. But just when that begins to feel like the center of the message, he pulls the focus outward again, because now he brings in something that has been present in the background all along, but not fully emphasized: the sacramentals. And the tone changes slightly again, because now he is describing not just internal alignment, but external expressions of belief that reinforce that alignment. He describes sacramentals not as superstition or decoration, but as tangible reminders of spiritual reality, things that anchor belief into physical life. Objects, prayers, blessings, practices that remind a person that their life is not operating in isolation from a spiritual framework. And the key idea he keeps returning to is not the object itself, but what it represents in terms of orientation. Because according to him, these things only matter insofar as they point the person back toward relationship, not away from it. And that distinction becomes important because it prevents them from becoming empty symbols. Instead, they function as reminders that keep awareness active. And then, almost naturally, he begins to move into something even deeper: the lives of the saints. But he doesn't present them as distant historical figures. He presents them as evidence that holiness is not theoretical, and that spiritual strength is not limited to a select category of people removed from ordinary life. And this is where the tone begins to shift again, because he starts describing the saints as people who lived under pressure, contradiction, and suffering, yet maintained a clarity that came from something beyond themselves. And he emphasizes that this is not about perfection, but about direction, about choosing alignment repeatedly, even when the cost is high or the outcome is unclear.